James, I'm Senior Naturalist with NHSN, and I'm equally delighted and slightly terrified to be here tonight to talk to you a little bit about a project that's very close to my heart that I've been working on for around about 5 to 6 years, as Emily says. And one which I owe a massive debt of gratitude to many of the people in this room for actually making happy in the first place, an urban flora for Newcastle and North Tyneside. Now, Newcastle and North Tyneside really do have a rich history of botanical recording, dating all the way back to Nathaniel Winch, active in the 19th century, to the botanists of the present day. I believe the first botanical record for what is now the conurbation actually came in 1730, when a chap called John Wilson recorded alexanders growing on the slopes of Tynemouth Priory, where miraculously, perhaps, it still grows today. And all of this meant there was a good amount of information for anyone like me prone to going down rabbit holes to really look up in advance. And I must confess that one name in particular stood out in these historic accounts. A gentleman called John Story, who in the 1800s published this lovely, well, catchily named title you see here, an enumeration of the plants found within 5 miles of Newcastle, published in NHSN's Transactions, no less. This can really be considered the first urban flora, at least that I found, that was carried out anywhere in the UK. And for me, really inspired me to want to know how things have changed almost 200 years later. But I can't not include some of the other fantastic names not often mentioned in the early accounts. And these two ladies, Margaret Dickinson and Henrietta Lorraine, in their own way did an awful lot to sort of capture that early flora, painting at various sites around Newcastle, and doing a lot of work, particularly in Jesmond and other lovely places. All of this, not just the record cards, has fed into that sort of base of information. So before I get into the project, just a little bit of context. And when I talk about the conurbation, what I'm effectively referring to are the North Tyneside and Newcastle council boundaries, the area shown here. Whilst it initially felt like a rather achievable and small task to survey a city, some people do whole counties and countries. What I thought I would do, I was to break the city up into monads, 1 kilometre squares, and after getting rid of some of the more rural ones on the edge of the area, I was left with 188 sites to visit, each a minimum of 2 times. Some particularly very interesting places like Jesmond, upwards of 6, to capture any plant growing there, either wild, naturalised, so non-native species, or anything self-perpetuating in the wild, so a garden tree that's seeded in a pavement, with the aim of really capturing an accurate picture of what we find. So with this area in mind, back in 2020 I started work on the urban flora, largely inspired by some of the farm titles you see here in Nottingham and Belfast. And all of this has of course meant many, many hours and many footsteps. I must say, as a non-driver, it was interesting trying to cover the whole city in any degree of detail. But that's now complete. And I'm really pleased to say that this being a rather large task, I've had so much fantastic help along the way. More so now, Newcastle and North Tyneside are increasingly being recognised as a bit of a hub for urban botany, thanks to people like yourselves. And one of the best examples of this, in my eyes at least, has come from NHSN's Gosford's Wild Web project, running over the past 3 years, wherein over 234 recorders shared their sightings of wildlife of all kinds across the city, which of course meant many records of plants. They're great because they don't get up and run away from you like so many other things do, which I guess explains the weighting to botanical records. So yes, this fed into that data set. But they were by no means alone, and one of the key aspects of Wild Web and of my sort of accumulating of the records was to really capitalise on the records of local community groups, the people who know their patch so much better than anyone coming from the outside to survey it. And these are just a few examples. And you'll see that what was found varies. You've got some wonderful rare plants here, like pyramidal orchid found at Rising Sun Country Park. but also the common and everyday plants like this bluebell, which so often we overlook and ignore. All of these records were very, very welcome. In addition to Gossos Wild Web, there's been a huge amount of work happening along the Ousburn as part of the Rhys Foundation's Ousburn Way initiative, which has seen wildlife and botanical surveys taking place everywhere from the lower Ousburn Valley all the way to Wolverhampton in the north of the city, and has yielded some really interesting results, including surveys of some of our quite rare or special plants like coralroot orchid. All of these initiatives and work by the British Botanical Society, by NHSN, by Eric Northeast has created a really good data set. So much so that we're now able to produce this, I guess. I was going to wave it around at least once tonight. But before I go any further and actually talk about the plants, I just want to say an absolutely massive thank you to everyone who helped, and that includes the recorders, the people who attended guided walks and surveys, the people who corrected me when I was wrong, proofread. It's only because of this massive collective effort that I've been able to do this. But before skipping this slide, I often love to include this photo to the top here, my husband Matt gazing lovingly at the orchids. You often get some funny looks when botanising in the city. And what you can't tell from this photo, or perhaps some of you can, is this is actually the verge outside of the Scotswood Road B&Q. People were pulling in to go and get their sort of drill bits and nails, and there was us lying on this verge. And it was quite funny, but that picture to me just demonstrates the kind of plants you find in very unexpected places. Unfortunately, 2 weeks later, they all had a haircut. So yes, after 5 years, the project is done and dusted, and as of today, it's actually published. It went live on Amazon this morning, and NHSN will be stocking it for the foreseeable too. There is so much in it, it's a rather hefty thing to condense into a talk such as this, so I just wanted to include here some headline figures. In total, over those 5 years, 1,123 plant species recorded across Newcastle and North Tyneside. That's roughly a third of the British flora. 38,000 records gathered in dedicated surveys, but 12,000 fed in from external sources, which revealed a really interesting split of species. 581 identified as native versus 471 neophytes, non-native species. And I guess the qualitative information come out of it too, the information on where to go to see particular things, where is home to our special plants, and importantly, which species are in trouble. That figure of the high percentage of neophytes is actually quite interesting, so much so that, much to my alarm last year, it was actually picked up by an author, Trevor Dines, in this fabulous book you see here, which stated that number we found together in Newcastle is actually far higher than similar studies carried out elsewhere in the UK, and we did quite a bit of head scratching on this. I think that's multiple reasons really. We've of course got things like ballast and a rich history of industry, but we've also got the everyday occurrences, garden escapes, birdseed. Everything we do contributes to this really sort of eclectic mix of non-natives out there in the city. But it is important to say at this stage that when I say non-native or neophyte, that does not mean invasive. Only a small percentage of non-native species are actually what you would call your invasive species, your Buhis plants, Himalayan balsam, giant hogweed. The rest fit in pretty seamlessly. One of the real gems to come out of the flora has been information on our most diverse and botanically significant sites in and around Newcastle. And as you can see from the list here, which is the top 10, there are some surprises to be had. Whilst you might associate Gosford Nature Reserve or perhaps Havana Nature Reserve with a high diversity of species on account of their relic semi-natural habitats, you might find it quite odd to see Ousburn Valley up there. A heavily urbanised square with very little natural habitat, yet home to a really incredible array of plants. Jesmond, interesting not only because it is relic ancient woodland in parts, but also because of all the weird and wonderful things done to it over the years, particularly by Lord and Lady Armstrong, who, if you've ever been to Craigside, you'll know had a penchant for very interesting plants, many of which are still there in the place today where they were first planted over 100 years ago. And then I needed a really sort of a rough and ready example. So this bottom picture is a derelict building site at Royal Quays. You do visit some glamorous places whilst looking for urban plants. And this lovely map from Eric North East just shows the sort of spread of those high diversity sites. As you can see, there's rather a lot of them, and particularly along watercourses, along the Tyne, along the Burn and the Seaton Burn. Lots of places to visit should you find the time. Okay, so of course the main feature of any flora is the plants. And throughout the survey it's become quite clear that the results are mixed. Some species are doing particularly well, whilst others, particularly our rare and scarce native species, are suffering. And one example of a native species doing rather well is the bee orchid, shown here in its quite exotic looking Var chlorantha morph, photographed by Chris Barlow on a roadside verge in Silverlink Business Park. This one is marching north in the UK, aided by climate change, and really has found a home on the sort of thin, calcareous soils of our building sites and post-industrial sites. So much so that in parts it's becoming our most abundant urban orchid, and if you go to somewhere like Scotswood Road, you can see hundreds of these. Other species doing well are of course non-native, they're introductions, and often these are the plants so superbly adapted to growing in the sort of harsh, inhospitable areas where little or fewer native species will grow in. One good example I find is Eastern Rocket, a plant from Asia, first noted in the area in 1936 by George Swan, who found it at North Shields, I believe. Since then, it's gone on to colonise heavily urbanised habitats right along the Tyne from Scotswood all the way to Tynemouth, and it's actually very, very common now. This one was growing in the sort of footings of the bank on Shields Road in Byker. Other plants doing well are ornamental in nature, the things we like to look at, we plant, and one quite good example is Atlantic ivy, Hedera hibernica, native to western parts of the UK, but not in the northeast, yet beloved by the Victorians, who planted it just about everywhere. And in places like Jesmond-Dean and Eaton Park, it has gone on to naturalise. We still plant it to this day, though people are always quite surprised to know that ivy is actually several species as opposed to just one. And for our last species on the increase, I've gone with a halophyte, a lover of saline soils by the coast, or at least traditionally. Several of these species, including sea plantain, are now moving inland along major roads where we spread salt in winter, changing the dynamics of the soil. And as you can see, you might expect this one along the Tyne or on the coast there at Wicklow and Cullercoats. But right up there at what I think is Hazelrig, that was a bit unexpected. And this species is not alone. We're now seeing sea aster growing on roundabouts. And of course, Danish scurvy grass, which you now see everywhere along central reservations in Newcastle. Of course, not all plants are doing well, and some, particularly our sort of rare and special native species, struggle to adapt to changes in land use. One particularly rare plant in Newcastle is Stag's Horn club moss, a lycophyte found only in remnant heathland at Havana Nature Reserve, where sightings post-2020 show a real pronounced decline, so much so that this plant now is only found within around 2 square metres of really quite rank heather. It's a species you would see in parts of the Cheviates or perhaps Kielder in the uplands, yet one which in Newcastle stands as a relic of sort of a time long since past when heathland dominated the landscape. To lose it would be unfortunate. Our ancient woodland plants are suffering too. Confined primarily to Newcastle's wooded deans, this valuable habitat has changed a huge amount over the years, so much so that many sort of iconic plants were lost a long time ago, Herb Paris being the prime example, which used to grow in Jesmond-Dean. But now, a range of sort of less specialised and what we would think as more resilient species are suffering too. And I picked this one as an example, woodbelloc, a really lovely grass which, whilst there are better populations in Subley and Frockley Deans, in Jesmond-Dean and neighbouring Armstrong Park is now confined to just a few small patches. It wouldn't take much to lose this one altogether. together. And just to emphasise this point, here we have wood cranesbill, another woodland plant that was recorded just twice during this 5-year survey, only as isolated plants in both Jesmond and Sugly Deans. Records for the last 30 years or so show that it was much more widespread, but realistically, it may soon disappear. And finally, grassland specialist, Dyer's greenweed, a really quite beautiful indicator of high-quality neutral grassland, recorded as part of this survey from only 2 sites at Havana Nature Reserve and Rising Sun Country Park, yet only within the last few decades it's been lost from sites at Walker, from big waters, really just demonstrating how our habitats are changing with... Okay. So I wanted to share a few plants that demonstrate perfectly the really quite surprising and eclectic nature of urban botany, and these 3 fit the trick quite nicely. We have autumn gentian, recorded for the first time in all of Newcastle and North Tyneside in 2024 from the margins of a haulage road at Brinkley Colliery. For me, this is a species you associate with high quality upland and perhaps coastal habitat, so to find it within a relatively disturbed urban area really was a surprise. Even more surprising in the middle here, pale St John's wort is a plant of magnesian limestone grassland with the core populations in County Durham. This one turned up on a small area of exposed rubble at Silverlink, where it numbers no more than 12 plants, but really is a welcome addition to our flora. And last but not least, a more recent example, parsley water dropwort, rediscovered last year by botanist Chris Merrill from reedbeds at Gosford Nature Reserve, yet upon a bit of digging, it was found to have been extinct in South Northumberland since 1800. Only to reappear with the slightest hint of disturbance right next to the boardwalk. So how we missed that one for nigh on 2 centuries is a task, but it just goes to show there are still things out there to find, even in a heavily botanised landscape. And this one too makes me extremely happy. Lesser parsnip, a plant which until recently was thought extinct in the Vice County. Yet, much to my surprise, this turned up when Matt and I were strolling along the Seaton Burn in 2024, and it was a huge, great population of it. Again, just emphasising what is there if you take the time to look. And then, of course, we have the confusing ones, the plants in funny places, and the species really that give you a bit of a thrill when you stumble across them. There are too many of these to count, but these 3 paint a good picture, particularly heath-fragrant orchid, predominantly an upland species found at really high-quality sites. Yet again, another oddity of Silverlink Biodiversity Park, where just one plant grows in an area of grassland created in the 1990s, where it could realistically have been imported with the substrate. Water violet, a really rare red list plant in the UK on the edge of its distribution in the northeast, found in a ditch behind a middle school at Seaton Burn. And cabbage palm, a tropical species here, which you will have all seen in gardens as you make your way around the city, recorded for the first time in a wild state from a bit of cracked pavement at North Shields. You can see why it took quite a while. And as we've been talking a little bit about weeds tonight, I thought I could not include this one, a really fantastic example of cannabis sativa growing on a bit of sort of earthworks at Wall's End. I wonder how this one got there. How these assorted oddballs arrived in the city is more clear-cut. They are all garden escapes. And I just wanted to include a few to demonstrate that just about anything can hop across the garden fence to become established in a wild state. Some of these are now very, very common, like sweet Alison to the top there, whilst some are much rarer. Cabbage thistle, found in Armstrong Park, was a good example of this. And on a final note on these plants at least, if one thing has become incredibly clear from this process, it has been that our urban areas are important for plants and must be included equally in future surveys. All of the plants shown here, alongside around about 40 more listed in the book, they feature on a quite important document called the Rare Plant Register for South Northumberland. meaning they are so scarce you ought to report them to somebody whenever you happen across them. All were found in areas which traditionally would not have been surveyed: a street in North Shields, a car park flower bed in Heaton. Again, it just goes to show. And if you're in any doubt about just how interesting our urban flora really is, where else would you find a snowdrop from Eastern Europe, a ragwort from South Africa, curry plant from the Mediterranean, and a fleabane from South America, all growing within 1 kilometre of sort of heavily urbanised Heaton? It really is a jungle out there. So, I thought I finished the flora back in the autumn, and much to my annoyance, but to the good of the dataset, people continued to find really interesting things all the way through the autumn until I eventually gave up on January the 1st and said I'm not taking any more sightings. But some of these, again, have been really interesting. And snowdrop here, it is just a common snowdrop, but it's a very special one. The Tyneside group yellow snowdrops found only historically in Northumberland, yet never in Newcastle. These ones were found at a site in North Newcastle back in 2020, but presumed they had disappeared until someone recently actually found them in flower again. I hope you agree, they are rather beautiful. And I have NHSN's reserve warden, Paul Drummond, to thank for this one. This is Fortune's holly fern, Asian species, never before recorded in our region, yet found during clearance works for the recent Wycroft wetlands, which you're about to hear more about shortly. How this one got quite far from habitation into the middle of Gosforth Nature Reserve remains to be seen. It doesn't get out into the wild very often, but Paul fed back that this was actually quite an old plant. And you may have heard about this one already. This was New Year's Day this year when NHSN's urban naturalist Ellie Davison and a group of NHSN members found Mediterranean nettle growing at the base of a garden wall in Jesmond. Jesmond is a real hotspot for interesting plants. This one is often imported alongside containerised citrus and olive trees. But again, it was the first occurrence for Northumberland. Well, that was a lot of plants. So, yes, we're done. It's been a busy few years, but I'm absolutely delighted to say that the urban flora is available now, really generously supported by NHSN and by the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland. You can get your copies, should you wish it, tonight on Amazon, or over the next week they'll be listed on the NHSN website. And inside you will find accounts for all 1,123 plants recorded so far in the city. If there's one thing I wanted to achieve with this, it was to produce something that groups, land managers, organisations can use to know what is on their land and what might be worth conserving. And for that reason, for the vast majority of interesting plants, precise grid references are given, enabling everyone to find them for themselves. The logic being that no one will protect what they can't see and care about and enjoy. Yes. And yes, today, this was the launch today, but actually it was a bit of a funny thing. I hadn't planned on launching this book until the talk tonight, only to find that The Guardian beat me to it at 5 o'clock in the morning when these articles all go live, leading to a quick flurry of social media content today. But I just wanted to include this because it's thanks to everybody who took part that The Guardian was interested, that other people are interested in this. I hope you can agree, urban plants are far from dull. And on a very final note, it's just to say that recording in our towns and cities is never complete, as demonstrated by that nettle. If you are inspired to go out and do something, to start looking at plants yourselves, there's no better place to send your sightings than NHSN's Gosforth Wild Web project, which makes those records accessible to anyone who wants to use them for a project. People like me who want to bring that data together. But with that, just an absolutely massive thank you, particularly to all of the botanists here tonight who've supported me over the last few years. It really does mean so much. And I'm thrilled to have published the book, equally terrified for all the mistakes you find in it. So please feed those to me via email. I'm more than welcome. But I hope some of you enjoyed. Thank you.